Welcome to the Voice of Retail podcast. My name is Michael LeBlanc, and I am your host. This podcast is produced in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Welcome to a new year, and maybe a new you regarding your perspectives around leadership. My special guest is Steve Worthy, who, with over 27 years of North American experience on the front lines as a senior retail store leader, brings a unique mix of executive coaching, training, and real-world experience to senior retail leaders and corporate teams. Let's listen in now. Steve, welcome to the first episode of 2024, The Voice of Retail. Thanks so much for being my guest. How are you?
I am doing well, and I'm super stoked to be here. And thank you so much for allowing me to be the first guest. Thank you so much.
Well, you and I had the chance to meet, the privilege to meet in, where was it, New York at the Lead in the summer. We'd crossed paths but never met in person. So it's great to have you on the mic. Where am I finding you today?
Yeah, I am coming from the rainy but nice sort of temperature down here in Alpharetta, Georgia, outside of Atlanta.
Saying that, you happen to be traveling up and down a few times to Canada. What brings you to Canada so often?
The love of my life, actually. I thank you so much for that. And you and I have been privy to some conversations back and forth, and had the great opportunity over the last couple of, this last year or two, travel back and forth to Canada. And now over Boxing Day, I actually proposed to Cher Jones, who is actually my fiance now. And so super privileged. And I think they're trying to make me a Canadian citizen because I'm constantly up there. So I don't know.
Well, we'll do everything we can. Well, big congratulations. That's huge, and it's not your first time in Canada. We'll get to that a little bit later. But we've jumped in. Tell the listeners. I know a little bit about you. I'd like to know more, and tell the listeners a little bit about your origin story, your path, and what you do for a living today.
Absolutely. So, just like a lot of us, my retail journey started out with not being in retail. After my service in the Air Force, I finished up my undergrad in accounting and couldn't stand it. Mm-hmm. Hated it. But it was that time, Michael, when, the Big Six was around. And so you could get your accounting degree and you can go back to New York City, and you were making 60, 70K, which was really good money in the mid 90s. However, I found myself in Charlotte, North Carolina, looking for myself, trying to figure out my next move, and stumbled upon a Caribou Coffee. And inside this Caribou Coffee, I ended up meeting the manager. She introduced me to her manager. He introduced me to the regional. And within about 2 weeks, I was offered a job as a district manager in training. And that started my journey into retail. And so, I've never looked back.
In my experience, for folks who've been in the service, you arrive to that with a lot of skills around people and focus and discipline and a whole bunch of other things. So I guess they would recognize that in you right away, right?
That's a great point because my first response to him was that I have no understanding about coffee. Like even in the service and in college, I was a Mountain Dew guy. I was never a coffee guy, and so. But that's exactly what he said, because I was a crew chief in the Air Force, so I had oversight for these, hundreds of $millions of planes.
Right.
And so that idea of perspective of, monitoring and leading teams translated extremely well over into the private sector, if you will.
All right. So from Caribou Coffee, you're a district manager. Tell me more.
Yeah. From there, just different roles with different companies. I worked for some of the largest brands, from store managers. I went back to store manager with Target and then moved back through with other companies to director of stores. And so from there, it became a matter of understanding more about leadership. What I realized kind of throughout my retail journey was that there was this gap that I had in my leadership that I wasn't receiving from my companies. I would tend to go outside and read a lot of books, attend a lot of leadership conferences, have mentors, and these were all outside of my company. And what I realized was that I was bringing a lot of that knowledge back into my retail experience. And interestingly enough, it almost seemed like I was sort of this kind of rock star because I was bringing all this information back. And I was like, hold on for a second. information is readily available to all of us, to all of you here in the retail industry. However, what we notice is that there are just a lot of organizations who are very from a training standpoint, they're very guarded, and they don't provide a lot of information and training that I see that a lot of leaders need. And so right now, as I started Worthy Retail, our job, our focus is to kind of close that gap. Our job is to close that gap with leadership from where they are to where it is that they want to be with our coaching and our training and our mentorship, and also our new learning community called the campus. And the idea is to make them more profitable from a personal and also a professional standpoint. So that's where I'm at right now as founder and CEO of Worthy Retail.
Well, fantastic. Now, you mentioned two things. One, earlier on, we talked about Canada. Two, you mentioned Target. I think you were up here during Target's adventures here. What were you doing up in Toronto with Target?
The great expansion and then the great retraction, if you will. I had oversight for a market in Central New York, and part of that process was to get with a team and connect with a team and bring a team over to Toronto to help with the overall expansion of Target at that time. And immediately one of the things, of course, as we noticed there was just a gap in training and knowledge. And I think you and I may have had this conversation before. If not, here it is. One of the areas that I quickly discovered was relative to Canada, and that process of us moving over there was that I think the biggest thing was that Canadians wanted more of an American perspective of Target. And I think we tried to give them a Canadian Target. And I think that's where the kind of gap happened. And so my job was to try to help transform some of that mindset and perspective, with my team, and also with the offerings and supply chain, all those aspects, and until we realized that it was just an untenable situation and we actually had to retract.
We could spend a whole podcast talking about that Target 100%. Episode. It was a big deal in Canada, and of course, you're not the only big international brand that's retreated. Lowe's just left, for example. And one of the things you mentioned, it's interesting. Let's talk about it for just a bit. Is Canadians were so? It's funny, right? Because the folks at Target and even us analysts, we would say, so many Canadians shop at Target. I think the number was like 30,000 Canadians had a Target credit card even before you got here. So, we're like, this is going to be easy. And it turned out, as exactly as you said, is that, and it wasn't all your fault, because there's just some weird rules and regs. You couldn't have the same product, for example, not even withstanding the language, but that the Canadians, they were so used to the Target experience in the U.S. that when it came here and it wasn't the same, it kind of felt like they were let down. And some of that was, some of that you guys would take ownership, and some of it was just, thrust upon you. So that was one of the symptoms or one of the causes. Would you agree? I mean, it sounds like that was your experience as well.
No, I would agree. I think initially, we did a great job of connecting with the community. Daryl Jenkins actually. At the time, he was sort of the liaison, if you will, from Target, and he was a senior vice president, and he moved over to Mississauga, and actually helped with the transition and making the landing sort of softer for us from a community standpoint. Did a great job of that, but I think part of the loss in translation was simply around.
That's a good way to put it.
Was simply around us, and not maybe having our ear to the ground. Of course, the product assortment and things along that line were going to be different, but I think we did do a good enough job of pivoting quick enough. Also, supply chain issues, right? I think we had a misstep there. So you know how that goes. Once you have backup in the supply chain, then just everything else just goes to pot. Planograms can't get set and everything.
Yeah, it's very, very tough. Anyway, my conclusion to that, I remember I've been asked 100 times, and we talk about it a little bit, is too much, too soon, too fast. I mean, you could have, with 10 stores, you could overcome any supply chain issue. You just muscle your way through it, but it's hard with, 130 Anyway, let's leave that one aside. Let's focus on something else. You've been in this retail game for quite a while. I want to reflect. I want you to reflect on your experience about, the training and the front lines. You've said you found some gaps and some opportunities that you're filling. What's changed over the course of your career that, you hear that a lot. Everything's a little different now than it was before. And in the context of your practice, what's the same? Mm-hmm. And then what do you think has changed that we need to, and you help us adapt to as an industry?
Yeah, I think the fundamentals, of course, of business are always going to be the same, right? It's always about sales, less expensive, and you have profit. But I think the velocity of that sales cycle, and also the connection that we make with customers has changed. Of course, I remember, if we can just go back from a Target standpoint real quick, I remember the great credit card breach in 2013. I think it was 2000 and maybe 11, I want to say. And that whole situation changed dramatically, I think, transparency as it relates to leadership, as it relates to what we're doing as a company. And we're seeing that kind of still take place now, where there are a lot of leaders now where the idea around transparency and who they are, what they stand for, what are you going to get from me as a leader? Those things are still in place. But right now, with the advent of AI, with the advent of data analytics and the decision-making processes that need to take place so much faster than what we have seen previously before, I believe that leadership intuition is something that is almost lost, but it still needs to be part of the overall decision-making equation, where we get so focused in on the data and we forget about the human element that's associated with retail, with leadership. And so making sure that we don't lose sight of that human connection. It was one of my predictions, for this year, was just around AI-powered leadership. I did this the other week, yesterday on my Win Your Week, my weekly live stream. The first prediction was around AI-powered leadership, how leaders need to embrace generative AI, machine learning, data analytics, and then how do you actually take all of that and make an informed opinion and perspective on that. So nowadays, that's where we're actually going to see more leaders kind of take and embrace as they move forward.
Say a bit more about that. Like lots of folks throw around AI, and you've injected, of course, you've injected it there into leadership. Talk a bit more about your perspectives around AI leadership. Chalk that field for us a little.
Yeah, 100%. And I'm glad you went a little deeper on this, because you can go to any conference, you can look at any paper that's out there, research paper, and it's AI, and. But what does that mean for the leader, right? What does that truly mean? And I think that's part of our the genesis of Worthy Retail, is that what do all these things, all these initiatives from a 40,000-foot view mean for the leader? Like the person, the individual, senior vice presidents on down to district managers actually have to implement these things. From an AI standpoint, it is getting familiar with it. I remember when we first got Zebra scanners into stores. That process, the adoption process, took years. I mean, years. And now when we start to think about AI, the idea around adoption and understanding its impact on who you are and what you do, not just your supply chain, not just your customer data, but also your ability to make decisions. And so an AI-powered leader has to have the ability to understand what AI truly is and its impact. We just created a learning lab on our campus, and it's called Generative AI for Retail Leaders. And it's just a one hour intense perspective around generative AI and what do you need to know, definitions, perspective, what are you currently using from an AI standpoint in your personal life? Because I think that's the other part of it, is that a lot of people think about AI, but we're currently using it in our everyday life. So why not think about it from a professional standpoint, and what does that mean as well? So when I think about it, when I think about AI powered, it's really building up your perspective and your thought process on how to use it and how it's going to actually impact you in your decision making as a leader.
I wouldn't call AI a trend, but let's talk about trends for a bit. Let's transition over to talk about your perception around trends. I mean, when I think of when I talk to retail leaders, and I was interviewing a longtime president of a big Canadian retailer, and he said, if you would have told me I'd have this many loss prevention people 10 years ago, I would tell you you're crazy. That's one example, but there's a lot of other intersecting examples. When you think of from hey, this is happening today in the store, what do you call that? You've called out AI. Again, that's probably not a trend. It's a just like hand scanners, it's here to stay. But are there any things like violence in the stores is a real problem, right? How do you train around that and lead around those things? Nobody wants to feel uncomfortable in the place they work, but unfortunately, it's a bit of a reality. Yeah?
No, 100%. And I think one thing that's never going to go out of style, and I did this as a projection for 2024 as well, was around psychological safety, right? When you think about it seems like a very soft topic, a soft perspective, or something that just like, you need to sit down on the couch and talk to somebody about. It's not. It is truly about creating a culture where your team feels safe and secure, and encouraged to kind of express their thoughts, their ideas, their concerns, their fears, everything without ridicule. And so when we start to think about, just to kind of talk about your assets protection example, people want to feel safe. They want to not just safe physically, but they want to feel safe mentally, where I can actually be able to come into a store or come into a market and have a conversation with Michael and just say, what are you guys doing differently? What are you doing to make me feel secure so that I can actually come in here and actually do my job professionally, right? And so you're going to start to hear more conversations around this psychological safety within stores that whether it's going to be from a conference standpoint, or it's going to be, senior vice presidents talking to their team on down the line. And how do we actually broach this conversation? And I was just talking to someone the other day. I said, hey, you don't have to have an agenda item that says psychological safety, right? It's not about this.
It's not about a box to tick off, and say,
it's not a box to tick off.
We've had that conversation. Feeling okay? Okay, good. Let's move on. Talk about inventory.
Let's move on. Did we cover that one? Okay, good. We're good. No, it has to be part of the culture. It has to be part of the ethos of who you are.
That's a great point. That's a great point. That part of the culture. That's well spoken. Let's talk about leadership. And Steve Dennis and I talk about, and he talks about frequently, a generation of leaders where at the very, very senior levels, you expected yourself, so to speak, to have all the answers. Now, in the new world, you've got a leadership means maybe something different. That there's partnership. You don't need to have all the answers, and you need to lead a team in different ways. What do you think about creating this culture? You mentioned culture. What's the key today to creating these cultures of success?
We meaning I focus in on a concept that I've created that's for our upcoming book called the Approachable Retail Leader. And it's just around approachability. Approachability it's not a new term, but when you think about it in the context of retail, and I looked over my entire career and I looked over the career of other successful leaders, their level of approachability was by far one of the biggest assets that they have. And we define approachability as the difference between being informed versus finding out. When you approach and you think about approachability in that context, you're able to save time, you increase your retention, but more importantly, you increase your overall capacity as a leader. When you imagine the days of, I've had this happen in my career. I walk into a market. And hey, Michael's leaving. Michael just left. What do you mean Michael just left the company? How did that happen? Right. So that's me finding out that Michael left the company. And then as I grew in my career, I realized that if I am able to develop approachability, I can come into a market and I can actually have a conversation with Michael before Michael is even thinking about leaving. Or Michael's just right at the beginning of thinking about leaving. And if I'm approachable
he can have the conversation with you, or he or she can have the conversation with you. He's like, things aren't going so well. Like, that's a tough conversation to have, right? Because you're like, if I take that first step, then I'm at a disadvantage by already saying that, or I could be, right? Like that's a super interesting point. Yeah.
Correct. But if you feel safe enough to be able to come to somebody and actually have those conversations, I've saved I don't know how many people from moving out of the company, but I've also had the reverse where people would come to me and say, "Hey, I'm thinking about leaving," and my conversation with them will be like, "Well, okay, I think it's actually a really good decision that you do that," and so it's the ability for people to be able to do that. I was in a Hyundai dealer, and I remember there was a gentleman who was working with me, and I kind of remembered his face, but I didn't remember. And he came up to me in the waiting room, and he said, "Hey, do you remember me?" I said, "I think I do a little bit." And he said, "I used to work for you. I was an assets protection specialist, and you came into the store. No one else was there, but you walked the store with me, and we had a conversation about my role and what it is that I wanted to do. And you said, 'Hey, do what you love. If it's not retail, like don't do it.'" So he left, right? And I know this is probably not a really great story for retail leaders in the context, but what I mean right now is that he's leading now an entire service department for a Hyundai dealership, and he's doing exactly what he loves. So if I wasn't approachable enough for him to be able to have that conversation with me, he would probably still be stuck in something that he doesn't really want to do. And so I think part of this idea and concept around approachability is to help people really kind of embrace who they are and find out where their passions are, and then you help cultivate that so that they can move forward.
Talk a little bit about your SMILE framework, going a little bit deeper on that for us.
Yeah, I love it. The SMILE framework, I believe every leader smiles differently. So the S is for self-awareness. The M is for mindful listening. I is for inspires trust. L is for lead by example. And the E is for effective empathy. Self-awareness is one of those topics, of course, that everyone wants to talk about as it relates to strengths and opportunities. I don't think about it in that context. I think about self-awareness as a leader as it relates to your why and how you respond in certain situations. Because if you understand why you are in your leadership role, why you do the things that you do, why you make decisions the way that you make them, and why you have conversations and communicate the way you do them, then you're actually at an advantage for who you are. Now we assess how you respond in certain situations. When you think about response, Michael, what I see so much right now, especially in retail, is that we have two different responses. We have the initial response, and then we also have the filter response. That filter response is it's the one that kind of keeps the status quo. It's the one that we respond in a certain situation where we just want to keep the peace. But just imagine you spent 10 years dealing with and articulating filtered responses. No one really knows who Michael is. No one really knows what Michael truly thinks. Neither does Michael, because Michael has spent 10 years providing filter responses. And so the idea around approachability and utilizing it in that context is to help people understand and remove that those labels and that veneer around a filter response so that they can respond in their authentic self. When you do that, guess what? More people see you for who you are, and then your approachability increases.
Fantastic. Now it sounds like you've taken the big first step. You're going to be writing, or maybe you're already writing a book, and what's it called? The Approachable Retail Leader. Love that title. Talk a little bit about the book and when we can expect to have it on the shelves.
Yeah, man. It's it's been a book that has been sitting in my OneNote for probably the last 6 or 7 years. And I could be very honest with you, Michael, man, I've been so scared. I was so scared to write this book.
It's a heavy lift, man. Writing books is a heavy lift, right?
Oh my gosh. I can read books all day long. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so amazing. And then you take on the arduous task of trying to write it. The idea around it is to follow a leader through their retail journey as they embrace the framework and the perspective of approachability at different levels within their leadership journey. And then, as most stories with the arc, it goes through where they start to turn and they start to teach other people. They start to teach other leaders the approachability framework. But it is a book that really gets into the nitty-gritty of retail leadership. One of the things that we focus in on, we have a newsletter called Worthy Retail News. The premise of that newsletter is very much throughout the book, where we talk about the unspoken challenges that retail leaders face, whether it's from the interviewing process, whether it's from leading a team that doesn't look like you, whether it's from hiring and staffing people, balancing diversity and equity, managing intergenerational relationships within the company and within your stores, within your market. So we deal with a lot of that. And the approachability framework is kind of laced throughout that book as we follow this person through their leadership journey.
Fascinating. Well, we're going to see that in 2024 or 25. What do you think?
It is going to be 2024. It is in 2024. Right. We're in the process of writing it right now and getting it edited every chapter as I move forward. And so it's a slow burn, but started the process.
Fantastic. Well, we'll look forward to that. All right. You've been giving us a lot of advice kind of weaved into this conversation, but let's wrap it up with a 2-start and 1-stop advice for the listeners, the retail industry listeners out there. So 2 things they should start doing in 2024 and 1 thing they should stop doing. Maybe, they're not doing it wrong. Maybe it's just changed, or it's in your discussion with your clients, it's just not working. What are your 2 starts, 1-stop advice?
Yeah, if I can start with the one thing that people need to stop doing.
Yeah,
is really to stop thinking that you are limited with where you currently are in your role. We have this perspective of imposter syndrome that a lot of leaders have, and when I say stop, I mean to stop the idea that you don't belong and that you don't have a seat, that you don't deserve to have a seat at that table. You deserve to have a seat at that table. We have to stop thinking that we don't deserve that seat at the table, and you do, especially in 2024 as you move to through this new year. Two things to start doing. Community. It is in this retail leadership space. I have seen it far too often where leaders are feeling isolated. Right, statistics show it, whether it's on Forbes or Harvard Business School, where 70% of leaders feel lonely. And what we have to realize is that you can't do it by yourself. You need community. You need to be able to connect with somebody to actually be able to, kind of quote unquote, let your hair down. I know it's kind of funny coming from a bald person. You can't really see me, but to be able to let your hair down, as well. And then number two to really start is to invest in yourself. Right. Number 2 is going to be invest in yourself. What I have seen is that a lot of leaders are waiting for their companies to invest in them. They will invest in you at a certain level, but if you really want to move to where it is that you want to be, first of all, you have to define that, and then you can take on the requisite resources to help you move forward. But investing in yourself, as someone who has done it and continues to do it, I've had a coach for like the last 17 years. I can't stand the guy, but because he calls me on my stuff and he tells me exactly what it is that I may be doing wrong. But he also just provides some perspective on some stale problems that I've been dealing with continuously, and he just provides a fresh perspective on that. And so making sure that you are investing in yourself in 2024 is definitely something that you want to start doing.
All right, fantastic advice. Now, you mentioned you do a live stream. How do folks get in touch with you? A LinkedIn person, and drop some links and websites and how folks can go and where they can go to learn more.
Absolutely. You can get everything on LinkedIn at Steve Worthy. That is the first place to go to connect with me. From there, you get access to whether it's the community, our live stream, our podcasts, that we do, as well as our coaching and our training as well. So LinkedIn is going to be the best place to connect with me over at Steve Worthy.
Well, fantastic. I'll put that link in the show notes. Listen, Steve, thanks so much for taking the time to join me on the mic. It's a great conversation. And listen, I wish you much success in everything you're doing and much continued success, and get that book out and your trips to Toronto. So we have to get together in person next time you're up in Toronto. But for now, thanks again so much for joining me on the mic. It was a real treat. And I wish you a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning into this episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, follow on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically each week. And be sure and check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast with Steve Dennis and the Global E-Commerce Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, Senior Retail Advisor, Keynote Speaker, Rethink Retail 2023 Global Top Retail Influencer. If you want more content or to chat, follow me on LinkedIn. Safe travels, everyone.